Okay.
Good
Welcome
afternoon or
to
morning
the
for some folks.
third Superversive.
Today we discuss dystopias, the fiction of society gone horrifically wrong. Basically, most of what we would or wouldn't consider to be a dystopia would be when the actual society is set up to be a horror, a twisted version of what society is supposed to do. This differentiates it from something such as, say, a post-apocalyptic world or a disaster story, wherein the disaster, the nightmare that people are living in, which comprises the background of the story, is an artifact of mankind's work. Although you could also theoretically have an alien dystopia imposed upon mankind. So I think the first we're going to look into is kind of the idea of there's dystopias where there's a sort of positive end where the boy meets girl, they get married, they escape the hell of the dystopia, at least for a better world, or at least one isolated from the horror, versus ones where the full crushing footprint of the dystopia comes in. I'm going to open out. What are your thoughts on that? And how it impacts it?
My first thought and my first question is whether or not if the dystopia has a happy ending, if it's actually a dystopia novel, because then it's just a novel of someone overcoming a present problem.
Oh, I disagree. I think the dystopia has to do with the government form of the world, not with whether it's a happy or sad ending. In some cases they escape, and some cases they get killed. Depends, either the dystopia wins or the dystopia loses. I said that backwards. Like Logans Run, where they get away at the end, don't they?
Yeah, they get away.
But it doesn't make the story not a dystopia.
Good point.
I'd probably agree with that. I think that I've always tended to look at dystopian more as a setting than a genre. I mean, it is a genre, but there are some works that are kind of very dystopian in their setting. You know, Neuromancer, the Fireball series by Poul Anderson all have these sort of dystopic themes to them, but are sort of different from say 1984 or Brave New World.
I'm glad you mentioned the Fireball theme by Poul Anderson, because that's a dystopia in the building, which is rare in science fiction to see them actually. What's happening in that book is the Adventists are trying to move to a computer-based society and away from a human-based society, and Poul Anderson, of course, is showing why that's a bad thing, at least for the human beings. And I also noticed that in older literature, in St. Thomas More, you have utopias being part of the speculative fiction. And do dystopias only tend to crop up in these later days because it's a real threat now? The other question I also had is, if I could just throw out a few more questions, is something like Star Wars, is the Empire a dystopia? Because it actually is a ruthlessly, aggressively, freedom-crushing, tyrannical regime that blows up whole planets.
Well, the issue of whether is a tyranny a dystopia. I don't think a tyranny is the same thing as a dystopia. I think a tyranny, if we've had any dystopias on Earth, it might have been China during the Cultural Revolution. A tyranny is a group of people trying to push you down. But a dystopia actually requires that the world is pretending it's a good thing. Like, you're supposed to have a government that works this way.
May I also offer that dystopias need... Excuse me, let me ask us a question. Does dystopias need a technology? Does a dystopia have to be a type of government that only the modern age can usher in, where computer cameras are watching you at all times?
Well, no, I think, for instance, in...
Does Lord of the Rings with the all-seeing eye count?
Magic? Yeah.
That's true. You certainly could have magical dystopias.
But no one considered Lord of the Rings to be dystopian fiction.
but he's not. Lord of the Rings isn't Mordor having taken over the entire world where you're living. But even just a bad place is not the same as dystopia. Well, the dystopias I can think of, whether it's Brave New World and 1984 or whether it's Divergence and Hunger Games, they're all situations where people are buying into it. We the Living by Ayn Rand, where she shows how Russia fell apart, is a lot like that. And the things I've read about the Cultural Revolution in China are a lot like that. But it's that the people around you are going to turn you in for violating the dystopia because they are at least pretending they've bought into the lie, which is very different than just, hey, I'm in charge and I'm going to tell you what to do, and if you don't do what I say, I'm going to send my jackbooted thug.
Yeah, that's just. I think you're right. That's just a tyranny. Even in Ayn Rand's Anthem, I would call that a dystopia, though the technology level, Ayn Rand rather cleverly said, was low rather than high. They barely just invented the candle, and the main character is Edison or Einstein, who just invented the Prometheus, he actually calls himself, invents the electric light bulb. So, but they buy into the philosophy. So let me suggest that dystopias are an examination of a political philosophy.
That's what I think. They're governments that have a philosophy that try to alter normal life. In a tyranny, you can live your normal life, and often if you just are a farmer living in or a little shopkeeper, the tyranny almost passes you by.
Not if you're a kulak.
But dystopia, there's an artificial idea about how humanity is supposed to be that you're supposed to buy into.
Yeah, it's all about assigning a secondary good the status of the primary ultimate good, and to the detriment or to ignore all other goods. So, for example, with Logan's Run, it was pleasure was the ultimate good, and all others could be subservient to that.
With the Star Trek reference, would Star Trek have been a dystopia if it had taken place, say, 30 years after the rebels lost, and a young man or a young woman was discovering that their history was a lie? And
you mean Star Wars, right?
Star Wars, yes, and was rediscovering
one of the cardinal
history and all of that kind of thing. Yes, I have made the grave error, but at least not and prosperity.
If we accept my lovely wife's definition of it as requiring a political philosophy that people buy into, I would say that you. But I'm just saying if we accept that definition, then the answer would be yes, if and only if you told the story from the point of view of someone who bought into the Empire's propaganda and was undeceived by it and was enlightened as his plot went on.
So it's a background and a story to be a dystopia.
I would offer that you have to have more than just the tyranny to make it a dystopia.
Right,
it's got to be about the politics.
Even after the rebels lost, unless the Emperor was trying to convince you of some social system you were supposed to be following, it wouldn't be a dystopia. It'd just be a bad place to live. You know, I mean, unless he was trying to convince everybody that left was right, or that, I mean, the Cultural Revolution in China, they were trying to convince everyone that intellectuals were bad, and that they took all the college students and professors and put them on farms and said, oh, farming's good, and they don't know anything about farming, and they starved. That was a philosophy telling the people what to do, and they all went willingly to this death. You know, and it's very differently than a guy who just comes around and kicks your door in and takes a much larger share of the tax money than you wanted to give him, you know.
So, going off of that, Jason asked the question if the world of the time machine in 800,000 AD, whatever it is, how do we feel about that in terms of dystopia? Obviously from... Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, you know, from the... It seems to me like from an inside perspective, like as an Aloy, that it would be kind of dystopic, but our perspective is obviously outside that culture. So
that's a good point. Yeah, if the story were about an individual Morlock or an Aloy, say rediscovering the past, discovering there was something wrong with what was going on, that would be dystopic fiction.
I hate to say it, but you gentlemen seem to forget how that story went. That story was a detective story where the time traveler who at first thought he had arrived in a socialist utopia found out that the the cannibal Morlocks were preying on the hapless Eloi. So I would say yes, that was a dystopia piece of fiction, because the discovery that the apparent good turned out to be the most degrading possible bad, the human beings were just cattle, or the Eloi were just cattle, makes it dystopic.
Yeah, I think there's no reason you couldn't, if you wrote a time travel story and you had your time traveler go to Oz and you had your time traveler go to Star Trek, you could have your time traveler go to a dystopia without he himself being in a dystopia story. He would go to a place like what happened in that book where, you know, he finds out the humans are being eaten or whatever. I mean, he would go to a place, and the place itself would be a dystopia where people were being tricked or forced into these horrible things.
So, what are the thoughts with... Oh, I'm
Our
sorry.
guest wonders if the French Revolution falls into the same category. Because isn't that a group of people taken in by a crazy idea who then just destroyed their...
The French Revolution is the original. The French Revolution is the thing of which dystopias are all reflections, the same way the Russian Revolution was a reflection of the French Revolution. That's the point at which the Western civilization left Christianity as its moral basis and tried to adopt various political ideologies as their moral basis. And accepting a political ideology as your moral basis is what a utopia is.
Isn't it older? What about Plato's Republic?
Plato's Republic was an examination of the soul and was not presented as a bad thing. It was presented as Sparta, a good thing. It was a utopia.
Plato's Republic, if you
Moors.
actually had to live there, might be a dystopia. But he was the guy on the other side trying to convince you Brave New World is in fact brave and new.
The utopia of Thomas More would also be a terrible place to live, especially if you were an ambitious entrepreneur. But it was presented straight up. It was presented.
I suspect
dystopias are mockeries of utopian thinking.
I suspect Sparta is, in fact, would be a dystopia. Certainly, if you were a helot, it would be a dystopia.
So, then, it almost might be a dystopia. Might almost be a satire of utopia.
That's what I would suggest. Yes.
Yeah.
How about this?
You take a guy. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Am I on the line at this point?
Yeah,
yes.
Yep.
Yes.
Oh, wonderful. I've been messing around with my microphone. Well, how about this? Dystopias are a commentary on modernism, the 20th century. You think of dystopias as originally being written in the early 20th century. You've got Brave New World, of course. You've got, I did a review of Milo Hastings, The City of Endless Night. And what you have in common with all those is a commentary about if this goes on, if modernity goes on. And that's why H.G. Wells' The Time Machine works the way it does. It's a commentary on the division of the classes, continuation of liberal England, etc. So yeah, it's political commentary, and it's political commentary on a specific form of politics. Are there any 19th century dystopias?
Yes, Erewhon by Samuel Butler.
Which is Erewhon, right?
Erewhon, yeah, Erewhon.
Yeah, and that was about what?
He never quite made up his mind what it was about, but it seemed to be mostly about if you treated criminals the way you treat sick people, as if they needed to get better morally, and treated sick people as if you treated criminals and you needed to be chastised and punished for the crime of being ill, and consequently it was a commentary on eugenics. Which
so
think of as being a Nazi phenomenon, but actually has much earlier roots. But
so my 20th century extends to the 19th century. I mean, that's political correctness today.
That's when the ideas started.
Go ahead and tell them about the Butlerian Dune thing.
If you remember the background story from Dune by Frank Herbert, the society had rebelled against rule by computers. And it was called the Butlerian Jihad. It's in the background. It's like in the notes in the appendices if you read it. And the religious rule was that thou shalt not make a machine in the image of man's mind. That's what David Hallquist had said. Butler, in his Erewhon, has the Butlerians, has the Erewhonese, fear that machines, and in the 19th century that meant clockwork machines, wristwatches, would evolve by natural Darwinian process to be superior to man, and so the Irwanese forbade the use of all machines, steam engines, and clockworks. And so Frank Herbert was rather genially making a nod of the head to Samuel Butler, and named his anti-machine jihad after him. Because the Irwanese, in addition to punishing people for being sick, also forbid all machinery for fear it will evolve on them.
So,
Hey, Nate, you had actually sparked this idea by mentioning the new movie coming out. Did you have anything to share on that?
TV miniseries it was.
From
Of the
Spielberg?
Brave New World. Yeah.
Oh, really?
And we got into a brief conversation about Brave New World versus 1984 and kind of the difference of looking at the cultures presented by them.
Yeah,
I always thought Brave New World to me was the most chilling of all of these books.
If you were an English writer, and you looked to the east and saw the Soviet Union, you'd see Brave New World. If you looked to the west and saw America, and you saw which direction it was going, you might see. I said it backwards. Russia's 1984 and America's Brave New World.
What I found so eerie as a child or a youth about Brave New World was that the main character, the character from outside, John Savage, seemed so like us, so like a normal, ordinary person should be. You know, so I think it stood out more to me than in these other stories where the characters start out already part of their culture, if you understand what I'm saying. Seeing it kind of the contrast was very strong.
Somebody needs to prod Jason awake. Yeah, on that point, Beyond This Horizon by Robert Heinlein had a person
Here,
from the
I just
20th
dropped in
century.
and out, so I'm listening.
Okay.
We heard you snoring over the mic, so.
I think that's
There's
DJ.
one in the background. Go ahead.
I just pointed out, Beyond This Horizon by Robert Heinlein has a person from the 20th century, Honest John Smith or whatever his name was. And you almost have to have those kind of anchors to us, otherwise we're not going to understand their society.
that's a really good point.
I think both in 1984 and in something like Divergence, they do a pretty good job of, you know, showing the society, but they're not as horrified by it as we are. And sometimes there's something kind of refreshing about having somebody come in and go, "This must be destroyed, knock it all down."
Let me recommend to you, if you guys haven't read it, The Fifth Head of Cerberus by Gene Wolfe is the best example I've ever seen of someone portraying a dystopia from inside the dystopia, so that if the reader is not careful, he could read the whole book and not realize how unbelievably horrifying what he is seeing is, because none of the characters react as if it's horrifying. To them, it is as normal as seeing Scarlett O'Hara walk past her slaves. They don't think it's a bad institution.
You know, that's interesting that you bring up.
Again? Is that Jason just falls asleep?
Was
DJ icon is coming up every time for that.
This is reminding me of giving a closing argument in front of a jury. I can tell him I got
Jason
that
says
guy.
it isn't him. Ben, are you awake?
Yeah, I think it's EJ.
I think it's EJ too, because his icon keeps
there?
coming up. Turn off your mic, EJ, if you're going to sleep.
It's
in the nightmarish future where everyone can hear you sleep over the computer that you're connected to, people make wry comments that are preserved forever on something called the interwebs.
So it's interesting that you bring up the Fifth Head of Cerberus. I don't know if I really picked up on dystopia in that one, but in a lot of Wolfe's more recent books, there's been this sort of gentle dystopia in the background. I remember in
Home Fires, it is, I think.
Yeah, Home Fires, and then the Lovecraft.
The guest, the unwelcome guest one. They mention postnatal abortion.
Yep, up to 5 years.
Yeah. Home Fires definitely was, because that one was a story about people swapping bodies and overcoming each other's identities. And so, I forget which one of you said, in all these dystopias, it's a question of if this goes on.
Yeah, and that's I noticed it just sort of this. I lost my train of thought.
Bob Heinlein in his Horizon story also has an "if this goes on" attitude toward it, and I think it is. I would like to. I think that confirms my theory that it's based on the Western civilization leaving Christianity as its moral base and trying to take a political ideology as its moral base, and then getting the warning from some writers: this is what you get if you take that as your moral basis. This is what the logical implication of that is.
Agreed.
I gave a review for Rennie, Jason Rennie, there last month's Sci-Fi on Paul Froese's The Plot to Kill God, and I started with the observation: communism trying out extreme science fiction plots since 1917. And it just seems like every science fiction plot you can imagine has been tried out by communism, and therefore you wonder if the flip side isn't true. The science fiction dystopias are just realizing communism, perhaps totalitarianism. I also provided a review on The City of Endless Night, which fascinated me. It was written in 1922, and it damn near predicted Nazi Germany. But he's reacting to Kaiser Wilhelm's Second Reich, but he's describing state worship, atheism, extreme, creating eugenic soldiers and this type of thing. But there's another one where they're really leaving Christianity behind.
I was amazed at some of the things predicted in C.S. Lewis's Planetary Trilogy. I only just realized that he wrote that before most of the science fiction we're familiar with. When I read it when I was young, I thought he'd written it later, after the war, and that after all these other science fiction books. But he actually wrote it before, and he predicts very well what happens in England after the war.
You'll be even more amazed at the prediction. He gets most of his stuff from G.K. Chesterton, who wrote in the 19th century, or the early part of the 20th century, foreseeing all this stuff from Kaiser Wilhelm's the German philosophy at the time that was familiar with Chesterton allowed him to anticipate where the Nazis were going, and he wrote a book called Eugenics, called Eugenics, about that.
Wow.
I have a really old dystopian book from 1893. Maybe it'll count. I'm possibly I'm the only person that's ever read this. I'm sure that's not true, but a guy named Eugene Richter in 1893 wrote Pictures of the Socialistic Future, and it's this I found it on the Mises Institute years ago, and I read it. It's this amazing story. It's this set of diary entries from after the Communist Revolution in Germany, and how and this is like 1893. This is before anybody tried this for real, and he just nails it perfectly. Like,
wow.
It's just what happened in Russia. Everybody wanted to do certain sorts of jobs, and they had to be forced to do other sorts of jobs, and then it didn't work, and people didn't want to do hard jobs, and everybody wanted to be gamekeepers, and it gets more and more oppressive and more disastrous.
It's kind of like it's obvious what would happen, but nobody would be crazy enough to ever try it.
Well,
I remember
it was like prophetic. Anyway, I'll shut up now.
That's really good. No, that's really interesting. I remember when I was young reading science fiction stories in which they controlled how many children you had, and I thought that was just so unrealistic because people just get pregnant. They couldn't control it. It would never happen. And of course, the one-child policy in China has been doing it now for 20, 30 years. And what I didn't foresee when I was reading when I was young was, of course, that they would just kill the babies, in many cases, before they were born. That wasn't one of the options that had come to mind for me. But it's really kind of scary and shocking to see these things come about, and it's amazing to see these people who could foresee them before they happen.
And what's funny about the one-child policy is, of course, that's a reaction to a complete science fiction fantasy. The Malthus fantasy that the population is going to outstrip the resources is make-believe.
Well, Paul Ehrlich got his Genius Prize and has been making money off it ever since.
And he lost the bet to Julian Simon. Yeah. He lost the damn bet, pardon my language.
Well, hey, John, let me name check.
A friend of mine wants her son to watch.
Let me name check Robert Hughes Benson to John there, The Lord of the World. Have you ever read that?
I'm on the chapter 5 right now.
Okay. Well, I don't want to give it away, but I think you've got the part where at the beginning there's an accident, and so what do the people do, what does the state or the society does? It runs out there with special emergency euthanasia
personnel. Yes.
Yeah, and so
kill the people who caught the train wreck.
He absolutely nails the culture of death in 1910. Yep. Amazing. Yeah, wow. He also, what was funny, I read that book in 2008, 2009, and the Antichrist, who is a unknown junior senator from a Midwestern state who gives speeches that are very inspirational, but nobody remembers the contents thereafter. I thought, oh, well, that's chilling.
Right.
No, that's not fair. We all know that the Antichrist is I can't think of his name now. Never mind. I would have made a joke, but I can't do it. Neil Gaiman. That was my theory. I'm very fond of Neil Gaiman, but I had a reason. So am I. Lucifer's a beautiful angel too. I like the guy. I like him.
Did y'all see that show's coming out?
Yes, I must say, I thought, oh, what a horrible idea, and I watched the trailer, and I must admit I loved it. So,
of course,
I'm sucked in by the evil along with everybody else. And for anyone who doesn't know, we're referring to the fact that there's going to be a TV show based on DC's Lucifer as written by Neil Gaiman, which is that the Lucifer who just decided he was sick of being in hell and opened the doors of hell and left and went on vacation. And the TV show deals with him living in Los Angeles, just kind of hanging out there and then having to deal with, both local and problems caused by his desertion.
A storyline that is theologically unsound, because we all know from C.S. Lewis's Out from the Silent Planet and from mainstream Christian theology that Satan's actually the Lord of this world and is running the place. We already live in a dystopia, people.
Right, but this is him going on vacation. It's an amusing notion.
Well, okay, yeah, I would think, and by all means, I'm surrounded by theologians who could correct me, but a story of that sort where he would cease being of that sort would be one where he would actually seek forgiveness and repentance for the myriad sins. That would be...
Yeah, but see, Neil Gaiman, since he's the Antichrist, wants to present it as if the option between God and the devil is just to relax, take a breather, and not worry about good and evil.
Well, not only that,
there's
but
a third option. And of course, if you look in dystopias in general, they're talking about there's no religion in any dystopia story. There's no dystopia story where a religious figure stands up and stops the tyrant, is there?
On the Lucifer subject, keep in mind that in some versions in real theology, in some versions, Lucifer, and I don't remember which versions these are, but Lucifer is thought to be a servant of God whose job is to be down in hell doing what he's doing. And the implication in the TV trailer was that he was supposed to be there doing something, and he had gone AWOL.
Yeah.
So,
it's like the White Witch in
Gaiman's defense, Gaiman's not a Christian. He's from a Jewish background, so he has a different take on it than we do. But
also, for the record, I don't think the actual comic was written by Lucifer. It's just a spin-off of Event in the Sandman.
Yeah.
Not by Lucifer, by Gaiman.
No, and I should say...
the truth comes out.
I don't think Neil Gaiman actually is the Antichrist, but I read his story mocking the problem of Susan from the Narnia books, and so that...
No. It wasn't that Neil Gaiman was the Antichrist. This idea comes from
me.
I
like the guy, don't get me wrong.
And I've met him, and he's delightful, and he's charming. But I said to John one day, if I write in the future, planning to write a story, it's going to have the Antichrist, and I'm going to make him like Neil Gaiman because he's extremely charming, And his angels seemed so evil and disgusting. I thought he seemed to be able to put across wonderful ideas or horrible ideas in a beautiful way. And I said, that's what the Antichrist would be like. Not that I think there's anything wrong with Gaiman, but that I thought, he'd make a good Antichrist.
So, Jaji, since we're on the topic of dystopias, tell them the story about the Francesca's ancestor from that book you read.
Oh, it's so creepy. I'll look it up. You guys talk about something else. I'll read you the quote, but you gotta talk while I do it. Look for it.
I have another question for the group, though. We've been talking about the Antichrist. Isn't dystopia the anti-government? The opposite of a good and just king is a dystopian society where evil is good and good is evil, and the propaganda of the tyranny makes all the people willingly do the most evil things, like having the euthanasia squad come by, or having the 2-minute hate against Emmanuel Goldstein.
The fascinating point is, what is the purpose of government? And I'd just gotten on an internet flame war earlier this morning, to my regret, over the very subject. But what the purpose of why a government is constituted, if it's radically warped, would be the basis for dystopia. You've actually questioning, why is it done? What is its purpose? Why?
Well, I've been dominating the conversation, which I apologize, but I do have an answer for that. Go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say, isn't government there to take care of you from cradle to grave and look after everyone?
So talking about our warped purpose.
Government is mother and government is father. I would say there's 3 answers to the question. There's the classical liberal answer, which is the government is the night watchman who is meant to protect your rights against invasions from outside and from crime inside. There is the older classical, and I would say Christian notion of government as, no, this goes back to Aristotle, that government is meant to protect the virtue of the citizens, not just their lives. So that the government is there both to instruct, urge, and inspire you to virtue, but also to punish the wicked and to protect the city-state. The third one is the dystopia answer, which is the government is there to encourage vice, to deter virtue, to have you kill your babies, sleep around, and do all the other things that the communists and the left-wingers generally really enjoy seeing done, and to promote Bruce Jenner changing his name after becoming a eunuch.
I did find the quote. I vaguely thought I read this quote last time, but I can say it again. So this is from a book called Wander in the Spiritland, which was written in 1896. And the plot of the story is it claims to be a true story written by a medium that's supposed to be dictated by a young man who's dead. And he was supposed to have lived a really bad life, but there was a very good girl who loved him, and she's praying for him. So he, instead of ending up in hell, he ends up in something like purgatory or limbo. And one of the things he has to do is go to hell to help people down there. He's part of a group called the Brotherhood of Hope. And he meets this ancestor of his who he admired tremendously. He's from a Spanish background, so imagine some sort of Spanish Don. And Francesco had admired this man tremendously in his life, and the man tells Francesco, he's living in a mansion in hell, and he tells him, your best moments I was with you. And as he starts talking to his ancestor, he realizes by best moments, the guy means when Francesco was the most prideful, the most nasty. So the ancestor tries to get Francesco to stay in hell, and he tells him, and this is that he can teach him to do things to influence the living. So Francesco says, "Again, I saw the power in intellect and in literature, in which I could control and influence through the imaginative, descriptive faculties of mortals who, under my prompting, would write such books as appealed to the reason, the intellect, and the sensual passions of mankind, until the false glamour thrown over them should cause men to view with indulgence and even approval the most revolting ideas and the most abominable teachings." And that was written in 1896. When we look around now, we see that that's actually happened. Everything that was considered abominable back then is now being lauded and is considered a thing that you get in trouble if you don't support it.
What's funny is it was not until the Enlightenment that the idea that the government methods could be improved was current in mankind. I mean, except for things like Plato's Spartan Utopia, not until the modern age did you get the idea that it was ever going to be different. There are always going to be kings, there's always going to be poor, there's always going to be emperors, there's always going to be a hierarchy, a class system, and people were just going to have to suffer and muddle through until the end of the world. A dystopia springs out of the utopian writings of the earlier generation. Things like we mentioned More. There's a whole body of literature there. Butler might be considered a utopia, depending on whether you approve of eugenics or not, and so on.
Well, my question is, I'm curious about the question of the modern ones versus the older ones. It was clear to me in high school when I read Animal Farm, 1984, Anthem, and Brave New World, that these were warning us of things we didn't want to go into. But somebody says here the idea that we can make people better and change human nature. Yeah, I think that's what we were just saying.
I don't know if there's an official name for that heresy, but
they're quoting Serenity.
That's yeah. Very good.
Is that a dystopia?
Yeah, they those blue-handed guys weren't they? Yep. He says yep.
Yeah.
I think that's David who's having trouble with his link.
I just didn't want to interrupt.
Oh, okay. Well, that's really kind of you. Anyway, well, all I was saying is that when I think about Hunger Games and Divergence, and there's a couple of others that we've mentioned that are not coming to mind right now, more recent ones, Maze Runner, things like that. I don't get quite the same impression from them. I don't read when I read Divergence, I think this is a bad idea to try to make humans live this way, and I think it should come down. But I don't feel this horrible terror inside of, oh my God, we're only one step away from this, that I do when I read something like Animal Farm. I feel more like this is a possible world, and like a fantasy world that's out, that could be there, and now there's a story in it.
But Hunger Games, on the other hand, I thought that the author intended that to be a if this goes on warning about things like reality shows and the inequality of wealth in society and the concentration of power into few hands and so on. That she thought was going on now.
I just don't get the, hey, we are going to be there in a few years fear feeling when I read Hunger Games setup. It just seems too, not that, nothing like that could ever happen anyway, it just seems too distant from the modern world, unlike when I was reading these things where I could see that we weren't, kind of heading that direction. Our guest points out, wonders
in 1984, the Soviet Union was in business. I mean, he wasn't even writing science fiction. He was just writing it. Yeah. He was just writing what if happened over there happened here in England.
Yes, exactly.
Go
ahead.
The impression I get, I'm not terribly familiar with the YA dystopia stuff, but the impression I'm getting from these works is less like they're out to make a point, as we are with the older dystopias, and more that they're just using it as a setting. And maybe it's less the case with the Hunger Games, since that seems to have sparked the modern dystopia trend. But following it up, it just seems like they're looking for, what kind of dystopia can we turn out now? Almost like it's approaching a potboiler status, at least from the perspective of someone that's not really a big YA reader.
Let me offer a theory. I'm also not a big YA reader. The theory is that most teenagers already feel they live in a dystopia, and so having a soap opera taking place in a dystopia responds to them on an emotional level, and they're not actually writing political satires. But since I haven't read enough to know if that theory is any good, I only offer it gingerly.
Does anybody else remember I remember a lot of dystopia sci-fi, including for kids, when I was young. That's why I was kind of surprised. Well, no, I'm talking about, I was reading the 70s. I think The Giver's a lot more recent than that, isn't it? What was that series that had the tripods?
The Tripods.
The White Mountains by John Christopher.
Yeah, that was
The
the
Irishman White Man, because I remember getting a very similar mood when I was reading that. That mood of being kind of frightened and like that something was wrong with the whole world around you.
For those of you who haven't read it, that's definitely a dystopia. The storyline is that children, when they come of age, when they turn 17, get this cap placed on their head that is a mind control cap run by aliens to force them into conformity with society. And it's kind of a very popular in the 70s, an anti-conformist metaphor. I'm sorry.
I also think Pretties, Uglies, and Specials falls into that kind of category, and that I don't think was sparked by Hunger Games. Those are the Scott Westerfield YA, which I always thought as being in kind of the same. I was always reminded of John Christopher's White Mountains books when I heard about them. They just reminded me of that kind of story. But I remember reading a lot of those when I was young, and I think a lot they just didn't kind of stick around, but it's not like they're new.
I remember reading James Blish's The Devil's Day, which involved, I guess it was a dystopia. It involved a priest who invoked angels and demons, and then there was basically there was the end of days, and Satan won. The last page was Satan won. I go, what a downer that was. Now that's a dystopia. But when you think about the YAs today, they're kind of dishonest because you have people. There's a very successful underground. The hero plugs into it and then wins. I mean, could you imagine in 1984 if midway through the book Winston Smith got plugged into an underground and overturned Big Brother?
Yes, that story was written by Alan Moore, and it's called V for Vendetta.
Okay, but
he did that deliberately. He had his crazy superhero overthrow the 1984 setup. That's what he said as much in public interviews.
Okay, all right.
And yeah, it is basically dishonest because that never happened in the Soviet Union. So it did fall apart.
Yeah. So why is that? I mean, there is a difference between culture when the Soviet Union is in the saddle and Nazi Germany is in the saddle. But we, looking back at from 2015, we tend to trivialize the horrors of humanity. I mean, I think a lot of that's going on. We're kind of taking a break from history.
Not in the Middle East. Not in the Middle East, because there's a theological dystopia that is, I think, it's far more horrifying than even the Soviet dystopia was.
Yeah, you can.
But we Americans, especially for the last 8 years, we've been sitting there. I always remark about during war how much effort is put into demoralizing and propagandizing the enemy at incredible odds and incredible expense. But we in the West pace disinformation by Pachepa. We do it ourselves for free. We do for the Soviets and the enemies of America what they couldn't get for trillions of dollars. It's a weird world we live in.
If you understand there's a spiritual warfare going on between the angels and the devils, you'll understand that there's people who work for the devils that are in our allegedly on our side and helping out the baby.
You may not say that.
I do sometimes think that a lot of things would make a lot more sense if there was something like a dark spiritual force behind it, because when you look at them, they make no sense at all. But if you thought it was a conspiracy, if you thought there was a purpose to it, it would all start making sense, Certainly for a book, that would make a good story, whether or not,
I blame the Illuminati of Vandal Savage. Hey, let me ask you a related question to that. Are conspiracy theory books where you find out the entire world is false, or the entire world is run by a conspiracy, and I'm thinking of like a Philip K. Dick or an A. Van Vogt story, is that related to the dystopia genre, where you find out that the pleasant life that everyone is living turns out to be...
The Man in the High Castle is a dystopia.
Well, what about The Matrix? Isn't that kind of dystopian?
Yeah. Totally.
I mean, the moment you find out that everything around you is fake and you're being used by something, that begins to kind of fall into the dystopia category, I think.
I wonder, though, if it's not really a question of mood there. I'm thinking about some of the. I'm not a big conspiracy reader, but a lot of the stuff that I'm familiar with, they don't have the same mood though.
That's true.
It's kind of like, space opera and military sci-fi have a lot of overlap, but they're not the same.
They're not in the same mood. Yeah, I think you're right. Can
I always
poll
think
the
of
group and ask you guys what your favorite dystopia book is, if you have a favorite, if that question's valid.
Okay. I'm old school. I'm going to go with 1984. It's just pure. It's pure, unadulterated evil. It shows how it works. It shows how the mind is crushed underneath, and it's an unrelenting horror story.
Mm-hmm. Did you think it had an element of satire, of dark humor in it? That Orson that he was trying to
Orwell.
That he's tongue in cheek, that he's mocking things that happen.
To an extent, you've got the entire thing going on with the newspeak in there. You have the institutions that have been renamed to the opposite of what they were, and I think that was also a jab at us, although they probably were doing that in England as well.
And jab at the Soviets too.
And there was certainly the business with some of the macabre entertainment that they had there, and that was starting around about that time.
It's so odd that we're doing in America these days exactly what they had to be forced to do by Big Brother. We're doing it voluntarily.
Panopticon.
Panopticon.
So I think I'm kind of fascinated by the sort of gentle, quiet dystopias of Fireball, that sort of thing. So probably my favorite dystopian work lately has been Voyage to Alpha Centauri. I can't remember the guy's name who wrote it, but there's a whole very Fireball-esque sort of thread in the first half of that book about the nanny state dystopia.
And there's a scene where they're engaged in devil worship and they don't know it because they think they're just celebrating the life spirit of the new world, and they're imitating some things they found in ancient like pre-Babylonian records they found on a planet of Alpha Centauri.
Yeah, I forgot about that scene.
It's very subtle and it's horrifying. It's like a Gene Wolfe level of subtle.
Is that Voyage to Arcturus?
No, Voyage to Alpha Centauri.
Voyage to Arcturus is a very different book.
Very different from everything.
Sounds like something I need to look at.
John has a whole essay on it that Castilla House is going to put out.
No, I have an essay on Voyage to Arcturus. Voyage to Alpha Centauri was a book sent to me by a friend of mine. No, and I lost his name, and I never found out, never thanked him.
Michael O'Brien.
Yes.
The person sent the book?
Yeah, I just Googled it. So
yeah,
I praise Google for turning your noun into a verb.
It's a fantastic novel. I highly recommend it.
Okay.
Very spooky, very spiritually thoughtful, and very well crafted. Very good world building. He very subtly shows you how the friendly, kindly bureaucrats slowly take over and destroy all traditions and all respect for human life. But he never actually complains about it. He just has it in the background.
On the subject of favorite dystopia, of the original ones, I kind of like Brave New World, even though I also hated it. I still think We the Living is my favorite because it takes place in Russia and it's so believable. When I read it, I suddenly understand how it happened, and I hadn't understood that before. There's a scene where the main characters, I think she's working in a library, and they want her to work more hours, basically for free. And the setup is that altruism is being pushed to such a degree. You're so evil if you're not altruistic that everybody's being guilted into doing work for free. And I read that and I thought, that's why Ayn Rand worships selfishness, because she must have seen this. I mean, it's basically semi-biographical, so she must have seen the opposite of selfishness be turned into a weapon. And while I don't think she came to the right conclusion, it made everything make a lot more sense to me. but it was still horrifying, and maybe even more horrifying because it was something that had actually happened instead of something that might happen.
Yeah.
If I can put my, oh sorry, I was going to say if I can put my vote in for most horrible dystopia of ones I've read, I'm inclined to go with Brave New World. I did a sci-fi episode ages ago, sci-fi show episode where I compared 1984 and Brave New World, and I have to say, at least at the end of them, 1984 is horrible, but at least what's the main character's name?
Winston.
Thank you, Winston. Okay, Winchester. That's not right. Winston at least can resist. He's still a human being, whereas
No, he doesn't resist the end. He's completely brainwashed at the end.
well,
He's sitting on a bench.
he's
He's sitting on a bench worrying about how Big Brother is doing in the war with these.
okay.
Asians.
No, okay, I get that. But I mean, in Brave
He
New
loves
World,
Big Brother.
they're raised from, but he has to be broken and destroyed to get to that point. In Brave New World, none of them are human beings anymore. They've all lost their souls, and they're happy about it. Like they think this is.
In 1984, there's a fight. In Brave New World, everyone's given up.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
They've bought into the system. I think that's why it stood out to me so much when I was young, because it seemed more horrible.
But in fairness, Brave New World is set a lot longer after, like in theory, 1984 could become Brave New World.
Yeah,
Given time.
1984 was only written 40 years in the future, and Brave New World is 500 some odd.
Yeah.
John, I think unfortunately you and I will need to bow out because we do have a guest and other obligations. We'll leave the rest of you to continue. But thank you so much, Jason, for having us.
For joining us.
I'm going to give my vote before I bow out.
And John and I will definitely.
Wait. I'm gonna give my vote for best.
Let me finish my one sentence, and then I'll let you finish. I was just going to say we will come back and listen to the rest of it. So keep shining on. Go ahead, John.
If I'm gone, other people have a chance to talk. I would say Gather Darkness by Fritz Lieber, where the evil Roman Catholic Church completely takes over the planet, and only science can stop them, and that's one of my favorite dystopias.
Oh, also, could everybody email me links to the dystopias they like with a short description of it, and I'll do a post on it for people's reference.
Well, that's
Absolutely.
a great idea.
Maybe a couple of posts. There could be a lot of them. Anyway.
Yeah, cool. Excellent. Well, we will send things in the next day or so, and thank you so much. And you guys continue.
Thank you.
All right,
and
fair
I'm
enough.
back.
See ya.
Bye.
See ya.
Okay, let me jump in with my two, which probably are not great literature, but one of them I mentioned is The City of Endless Night, which is totally unknown, and it's 1920, 1922. The German Empire has been reduced to Berlin, buried deep in the ground, and a very stratified society, and it's just fascinating to read it from the standpoint of drawing a bead on what was in the air before the Nazis took power. And then the other one I like is I like it for almost the same reason, and it's Jack London's The Iron Heel. Jack London was a big old socialist, and this is his discussion of how capitalism creates a dystopian reality, and it's up to brave socialists for the next 200 years to fight against it. And again, you can see it. These books are fascinating because they're alt-hist. They're originally science fiction, but now they're alternate history books of what could have happened if something had gone differently. And again, obscure books, they may not be great literature, but as historical pieces, they're fascinating.
Nope, I don't have anything to say. Continue.
Someone talk.
Oh, golly. I didn't mean to stun everybody with my my two favorite dystopian books, which I'm helpfully putting links to on the sidebar.
Yeah, I got distracted reading your links.
Judge and John leaving. Everyone forgets how to speak.
Yeah.
And we're so in shock we don't know what to say.
Well, what does everyone think?
Nate. Sorry, go.
Well, if we've all put our favorites up, and I'm sending the email on that here shortly, but what are our thoughts on sort of the hard versus soft dystopia that's come up a couple of times? You know, as opposed to boot on face forever, which would be hard, the ones where they don't even really understand what they're living in. They go through life in kind of either a daze, or they're so deceived into it that they're happily supporting it until they realize the mind-numbing horror of what they're actually facing.
Well, we call that college campuses.
Don't all of the dystopias, even Brave New World, for example, have a very hard edge in the background though? Like, if you try to be if you try to rise a bit or otherwise not fit into the system, you will be hammered down very, very hard and put back in your place. So it's not like the soft, fluffy ones don't have a very hard edge. It's just I don't know, what are the mailed fist in the velvet glove, perhaps? But because I was thinking of Fahrenheit 451. Well, do I admit this publicly? I've only seen the movie, but
I haven't read the book either, so it's okay.
But at least the feel I got from that was it's the people are relatively happy, but you have the firemen running around and burning everything that doesn't belong. Equilibrium was similar in that regard, I guess.
Oh, that's
anyone
a good
saw
movie.
that.
Yes, Equilibrium is a surprisingly good movie for, like a cult classic.
Hey,
EJ, the definition of a guilty pleasure.
Yeah, I was apparently I've tried to cut in twice and didn't realize I was muted out.
Oh, that's all right. You were making weird noises before, so Judgy muted you, and I was a bit concerned you'd one over or something.
Well, okay. Well, thanks anyway.
You're back.
I'll just leave you guys as long as.
No.
No, really. That's okay.
Fine now. Tell us.
No, it's really not necessary, Jason. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
No, EJ, whatever the noise was that was weird is gone now. So please tell us, interject. Tell us your favorite dystopian fiction.
Well, no, I was going to discuss that. The what's happening now is, and the point that this is even, I think, being done in this meet up is because of the media, because of the film stuff that's coming out. And if we are going to talk about that, you can't not look at 1927's Metropolis. That was a 2-hour movie when nobody made 2-hour movies, and it was kind of certainly the mother of all dystopian movies.
I've never seen that. Does that have a plot line to it? I mean, obviously it probably does, but what is it?
Yeah, well, there's a working class and city planners, and the working class are basically treated like drones, and forced in the hours are insane, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the cities' big shots falls in love with a working class prophet, supposedly, who predicts the coming of something that's going to save them all. And that's, of course, this female robot. That saves the masses from the abuses of the higher ups, so to speak.
I'm ashamed to say it's been sitting on my Netflix queue for ages now, and I've never gotten around to watching it.
Well, it's not that easy to watch because it is very old. And
is it German?
Yeah.
Okay, it's like I've seen the picture, of course, of the female golden robot for 40 years, but it's never dawned on me that, hey, there's a movie I want to watch. So.
Well, I don't think there's a lot of movies from 1927. that you think you might want to watch.
Mm-hmm.
You know, really, unless someone points you that way, and it doesn't have much value other than being the first truly dystopian movie.
I've never been tempted even once to watch Birth of a Nation.
No, but that's not a good movie because of the fact that because of its content or its writing. It's supposedly a good movie because of the things it does, the cuts to action and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
That would be something that someone should watch if they want to watch a movie about how to make movies or how to write screenplays.
Yeah, film school students.
Yeah, exactly. It's not a movie that you watch because it's the best chase scene movie or the best rebel movie or anything like that. It's strictly because nobody knew how to make movies, and this person with strange ideas happened to be the first one to make one properly.
So David's asking if we have any dystopian societies in our own fiction. And I'm not a huge guy for like the heavy-handed hard dystopias, but as I've said a couple of times earlier, I like the background sort of soft dystopias, the ones where you could maybe go either way. And the novel that I have coming out from Castalia House, when I finish it this year, I have gone to great lengths to sort of paint a question as to whether or not their culture is utopic or dystopic. So,
yeah, the only work I've done is that is really near future dystopia, and most of it is really pretty realistic. The problems with child labor in China, and using that for an excuse for kind of urban fantasy, like Bunny Rabbit that Jason published a few months ago, and I've got another piece that's has to do with a Japanese goddess, Koyan, who is the goddess of wood or trees, and comes out of a piece of wood where they're being forced to make wooden toys for the Americans. So, but that's the closest I ever come to a dystopia, and that the dystopia is, it really kind of is, because it's true. I mean, you've got these exceptionally poor children working as slaves across the river from children who are going to good schools. You know, depending upon where you are in the party. You know, we have quite a dystopia right there in China right now.
Mm-hmm. Communism, creating science fiction plot devices since 1917.
Works for me.
You know, it's always amazing to me how life really is stranger than fiction sometimes, and you know, the crazy communist things. And my mother just emailed me earlier this week about Nazi attempts to rebreed some extinct, like extremely violent cattle, and it's like,
you know, cattle.
Yeah. I had never heard that, and I guess she just found it referenced somewhere. And it's, you know, this is the reason why Nazis are going to be in our stories for hundreds of years now, because everything we make up, short of, you know, Kung Fury, they tried. So
James Blish had a story where it was set on a world, the Earth, I assumed, where they had developed sex selection drugs. And of course, everybody wanted boys, and the next thing you know, we have 80% boys and 20% huge social dysfunctions, leading to chaos, leading to a space trip, leading to them reseeding the Earth and being Adam and Eve. But the first part of it was chilling, the part about the sex selection drug. Well, it just took, you know, China 20 years after that to go create, you know, sex selection abortions and have an imbalance of males to females by 30 million men who will never get married, who have nothing better to do. I mean, there is an explosive powder keg just waiting to blow there. And let's hope that they keep the lid on.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, they've got plenty of extra soldiers of the people to send over here and
or anywhere.
Yeah,
anywhere. And James Blish had it mapped out in 1955.
Well, that was right in between the Chinese Communist two conflicts, their assistance in Korea and their their Vietnam War. It wasn't, Vietnam's war. It was
Well,
China's war.
He wasn't writing about China. He just took a what if.
Right. No, I'm just saying
select the gender of your child.
Right dead between their two attempts at increasing their sphere of influence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We're talking about citizens who are convinced that dystopia is true. Then you can also give the example of the communists. You have people who are being led to their execution in the bottom of the whatever building it was that they had thousands of executions a day.
Lubyanka?
Praising Stalin's name as their last words before they're shot, and just how big a delusion it was. For an interesting factoid, my father-in-law was actually imprisoned by the communists for a short time for distributing pro-democracy leaflets, and a friend of my wife's family was imprisoned for a decade and tortured for being too great a religious influence. You might have heard of this story, In My Enemy's Camp. Anybody?
Yes.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, that was a friend of my wife's family. She knew him, actually met him, and she's translating that book into Czech as we speak.
And as soon as I heard about this riverboat that killed a boat full of people on the Yangtze River, I found it very interesting that it was almost all elderly people. And the Chinese really don't know what to do with their elderly people. I think it's a hell of a coincidence. They got rid of 400 of them real quick.
Let's see. So it's interesting that there's a lot of people that are getting these sort of true to life dystopias out, and it's good for people to remember it because we don't have a terribly good memory, it seems, as a culture too often.
Like what I was saying at the start about when secondary goods become valued as the primary good to the exclusion of all others, that's the source of most believable dystopias, is where that thing, that virtue is taken as the ultimate good, like compassion becomes the ultimate good, so we get the victimocracy that we see with social justice bullies, whoever complains the loudest, whoever's the biggest victim gets to decide everything and is automatically superior. And so it might be an interesting exercise to look at the various dystopias and to see what is that good that has been placed in the highest position to overrule all else. And so that's the kind of warning that they're giving us.
Yeah, and seems to be repeating, but we're not listening.
Yeah, well, I think there's always this sense that, we have history behind us, so we saw what they did wrong. We can, we'll do it better this time.
Well, there's also pride.
I think we do. We do it better. The problem is we don't do it right. I mean, we do it a little bit better every time, but we're still doing the same things. It might not be as bad as in the 40s, as in the 20s, etc., but it's still happening.
Churchill had an amazing quote for the United States. He said, "Americans can be counted upon to do the right thing after exhausting all alternatives."
That is my country. Yep.
Yeah, Mark Shea.
Isn't that true of humanity in general?
That's a good question. Is that true of humanity in general?
I don't know if that many other countries feel they have to be the savior for the world. Ever since the Soviet Union fell from trying to compete to being the savior of the world, it seems like we've decided politically that we're going to save everybody, regardless of the harm to our own people or regardless to whether anybody wants to be saved. The United States can't always be the policeman of the world, or that is a modern day dystopia.
Well, I think America is more open to change than a lot of other cultures. Like China has always been anchored and crippled by traditions. That's very true in a lot of other African societies, that the tribal beliefs overrule all possibilities of development, with the animism in maybe Papua New Guinea or all these other countries where the tendency to actually try new things is looked down upon and is much more difficult. So you're going to get a lot more of these things have been tried out in America with its culture of everybody's a little communities all trying out different systems, and whatever works we'll try that, or we'll implement it elsewhere, or how it's in theory it's supposed to work. So in that respect, America is going to be ahead of a lot of other countries in a lot of respects. It's going to have tried a lot more things.
Yeah, and I think that the fact that we're such a young country for being a major player in global politics, we don't really have a huge sense of tradition here. I mean, there are buildings here that are older than my entire nation. So.
Yeah, that does make a big difference. You can't walk out anywhere in this country and see something that was here 4,000 years ago.
No.
And you can do that in Africa and Asia and Europe.
Yeah, I've got a good friend in England who doesn't understand our obsession with castles. And it's, well, we don't have them unless someone built them because they thought they looked pretty.
Somebody like Hearst.
Yeah, the closest we got is I'll sometimes go visit Fort McKinley and things like that, but those are really our earliest fortifications, and they already.
Yeah. And most of those were torn down, like the one that you got the little markers at Michigan Avenue and Wacker where the original fort was. Little markers in the sidewalk.
Come here, we've got tons of them. We're the most overrun country in Europe, so we had to have castles everywhere.
Yeah, there used to be something here. We don't know how important it is, but we'll put a little piece of brass in the concrete here, and it'll make us remember it. Not enough to keep it here, but.
Yeah.
All right, guys. Well, I have my in-laws coming over for a cookout shortly, so I should probably drop out right about now and go get ready with things.
Okay, I'm getting a little shorter. I guess we ran over a little bit. I think we were going to do about an hour. Were we going to go a little more? Or?
I think we're always aiming for an hour, and we never quite hit it.
No, we're never going to hit it. Don't be silly.
Let's aim for a half hour, then we'll nail it.
New dystopian rule. It must be an hour.
Just don't send the Sandman after me. So, anyways, it's been fun, guys, and I look forward to the next one.
Thank you, sir.
It has been fun. Does anyone want to offer any final thoughts before we round things out?
I'm good.
Just maybe some thought on what the next thing would be. These are a lot of fun.
We don't want to discuss that while we're live. That was all.
There you go.
Okay.
Oh, Peter sends his apologies. He dropped out and he can't get back in. So.
Yeah, I was muted and didn't even know it. Does that make me feel like a fool?
He says it was fun. Anyway, any closing thoughts from people to round the broadcast out? We can keep chatting afterwards. That's fine.
No, I think that we're going to continue to see it, and if you push it, you can say almost anything is dystopian. I mean, even this Ex Machina movie that just came out being a foreshadowing of a dystopia. So, it depends on how much you want to stretch it. Almost anything that's not space opera or something like that could be considered dystopian.
Okay, I'd agree with that.
Yeah, if you have an active group that's opposing the
political,
the iron bootsteps
society,
of
whatever
it is, then it's not a dystopia. It's an action movie, or it's a sci-fi action, but if it's one or two people against the Leviathan of the state, then it's a dystopia.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it. I agree.
I'd say not just Leviathan of state, but the culture and society at large.
Sure. Yeah, well, a lot of people. Yeah, exactly. The state state and culture, and for what we're discussing here, are kind of one and the same, frighteningly enough. I think that's maybe a good idea of how dystopia starts. The state becomes a culture, which the state is always trying to do.
All right, and on that note, shall we bring the stream to an end? Thank you, everybody, for participating. All right.
You.